Liera was a woman whose life was measured in floor scrubbing and silent sacrifices. Her only goal was to get through her shifts at the Kong estate with her dignity intact and her siblings' stomachs full. But on a night filled with the clink of crystal and the scent of expensive cigars, she reached for a discarded steak, a piece of waste that could buy her family another week of survival. The owner of that steak was Kong Dae-hyun, a man whose cold judgment was as sharp as the blades his men carried. What Era didn't know as she tucked that plastic container into her apron was that she hadn't just committed a minor theft. She had stumbled into a public execution of her character. Taking the food was an act of love, but it was also the first irreversible step into a world ruled by an iron boss who had never known the meaning of hunger until he saw it reflected in her eyes. Liera was a ghost in a palace of gold. At 23, she balanced the heavy, polished silver trays of the Kong estate, a sprawling fortress of wealth and blood on the hills of Seoul, with the relentless demands of a home life that was slowly fading into gray. She was invisible, efficient, and knew the value of every grain of rice, usually the kind left behind on a plate of half-eaten lobster. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun, hiding the exhaustion that lined her face, and her quiet movements were a stark contrast to the loud, arrogant laughter of the city's underworld elite. She was driven by an uncompromising vision, a warm bed for her brother, a full fridge, and a world where she didn't have to choose between her medicine and their dinner. That dream was her only light, but the path to it was a long, exhausting crawl through 16-hour shifts and the stinging insults of the head housekeeper. It was 11:30 p.m., and the grand banquet was finally winding down. Era was clearing the long mahogany table, her mind already running through the bills she needed to pay by morning. Her back throbbed a familiar dull complaint against the cold marble floor. She glanced toward the head of the table, the seat of power, observing the man who had sat there all night. Kong Dae-hyun was a study in lethal stillness. Dressed in a dark navy three-piece suit that cost more than Era would earn in a lifetime, he had a sharp, chiseled look, eyes that moved like a predator's, and a silence that felt heavier than a scream. He was the kind of man who commanded the air in the room, making it thin and dangerous. As Era reached for a silver platter of untouched ribeye, she didn't realize that his intense, narrowed gaze had finally landed on her. The sun was not yet up when Liera began her day. While the rest of the city slept, she was already on her knees in the great hall of the Kong estate. The floor was made of white marble that felt like ice against her shins. She moved her brush in steady circles, scrubbing away a tiny scuff mark that only she could see. To the world, this house was a palace of power and gold. To Era, it was a never-ending map of dust and stains that she had to erase before the Iron Boss woke up. Every room in the mansion told a story of wealth that Era could barely understand. In the dining room, the chairs were covered in velvet that felt softer than a cat's fur. The chandeliers above looked like frozen rain made of diamonds. On the walls, there were paintings of dark forests and silent mountains, held in frames of heavy gold. Era often looked at her own reflection in the polished silver vases. Her face looked thin, her dark skin pale from the long hours, and her eyes always seemed to be searching for a rest that never came. As the morning went on, the house began to wake up. The smell of expensive coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. Era's stomach let out a quiet, painful growl. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. She had used her last few dollars to buy a carton of milk and some eggs for her younger siblings. She told them she had already eaten at the big house, but the truth was that her stomach felt like a crumpled piece of paper. She watched as the kitchen staff prepared plates of fresh fruit, smoked salmon, and thick pancakes. "Don't just stand there staring, girl," the head housekeeper snapped. Mrs. Choi was a woman with a face as sharp as a thorn. She wore a crisp black dress and carried a ring of keys that jingled like a warning. "The boss has a meeting with the syndicate leaders tonight. If I see a single fingerprint on the mahogany table, you'll find yourself on the street without a paycheck. Do you understand?" "Yes, Mrs. Choi," Era whispered, bowing her head. She didn't mention that she had already polished that table 3 times. She moved to the upstairs hallway, working like a shadow. She saw the guards in their sharp suits, their faces like stone, and their hands near their holsters. They didn't look at her. To them, she was just part of the furniture, like a lamp or a rug. She watched from a distance as Kang Dae-hyun stepped out of his bedroom. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that cost more than her family's apartment building. He didn't say a word, but the air in the hallway seemed to grow heavy just because he was there. Era pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath until he passed. She was a ghost in his world, a girl who lived on the scraps of his life. She spent her afternoon cleaning the guest rooms, her mind always on the ticking clock. She needed this job. She needed the money for the rent and the heat. But as she watched the sun go down and the elite guests begin to arrive for the banquet, the hunger in her stomach became a sharp, burning fire. She didn't know it yet, but the leftovers from this night would change her life forever. The night air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and heavy perfume. Inside the grand dining hall, the long mahogany table was a sea of white linen, sparkling silver, and crystal glasses that caught the warm glow of the candles. Era stood in the shadows near the kitchen door, her hands folded neatly over her white apron. She watched the guests, men in dark tuxedos and women in shimmering silk dresses, laughing as they talked about millions of dollars like it was pocket change. Waiters moved back and forth, carrying heavy silver platters. There were giant lobsters dripping in butter, thick steaks seasoned with rare herbs, and bowls of fruit that looked like bright jewels. Era's mouth watered, so much it hurt. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and the smell of the warm bread rolls was almost enough to make her dizzy. She leaned against the cool stone wall to stay steady, her stomach letting out a sharp, quiet pinch of hunger. She looked at the plates as the waiters brought them back to the kitchen. Her heart sank. A man at the end of the table had taken only one bite of a perfectly cooked steak before pushing the plate away. A woman in a pink dress had left an entire lobster tail untouched, buried under a pile of lemon slices. To these people, the food was just a decoration. To Era, that single plate of leftovers could feed her younger brother and sister for 3 days. She thought of her tiny apartment on the edge of the city. She could almost see her brother, Leo, sitting at their small, scarred wooden table. He would be trying to do his homework while his stomach made those same growling noises hers did. She thought of her sister, Mia, who had asked this morning if they could have chicken for dinner. Era had told her maybe soon, knowing there was only half a bag of rice left in the cupboard. Ida, stop daydreaming and clear the dessert plates. Mrs. Choi hissed as she walked past, her eyes narrow and mean. Era jumped and began to move around the table. She kept her head down, avoiding the sharp, cold gaze of Kang Dae-hyun at the head of the table. He wasn't laughing like the others. He sat perfectly still, watching everyone with eyes that seemed to see through walls. Era felt like a ghost as she picked up the expensive china. She saw a large piece of prime rib sitting on a discarded plate, about to be scraped into the trash bin in the kitchen. Her heart began to beat a fast, nervous rhythm against her ribs. It was a waste. It was a sin to throw away such a thing when children were crying for bread. She looked toward the kitchen door, then back at the table. If she was quick, if she was careful, she could save it. She could hide it in the small plastic container she had hidden in her apron pocket. Her hands shook as she reached for the plate, the golden light of the chandeliers feeling like a spotlight on her back. She didn't realize that from the head of the table, the Iron Boss was watching her every move. The grand dining hall felt very hot, and the air was thick with the smell of rich food. Era felt her heart thumping in her ears as she reached for the silver plate at the corner of the table. On it lay a thick, expensive slice of steak that had hardly been touched. She looked around quickly. The guests were busy laughing and drinking wine. Mrs. Choi was in the kitchen scolding a waiter. This was her only chance. With trembling fingers, she pulled the small plastic container from her hidden apron pocket and slid the meat inside. Before she could snap the lid shut, a hand clamped around her wrist like a band of cold iron.
Ara gaspet, her bir et cacin in her troat.
She looked up and met the gaze of Kang Dae-hyun. He had moved so silently that she hadn't even heard him stand up. He didn't look angry, he looked disgusted. His eyes were narrowed, and his jaw was set in a hard, straight line. The golden light of the chandelier glinted off his dark hair, making him look like a statue of a vengeful god. "What do you have there?" His voice was a low, dangerous growl that cut through the noise of the room. Suddenly, the laughter at the table died. The clink of silverware stopped. One by one, the elite guests turned their heads to watch. A woman in a diamond necklace gasped, covering her mouth with a silk napkin. The men in tuxedos leaned forward, their faces filled with a cruel kind of curiosity. They were the silent jury, and they had just found their evening entertainment. I was just... Era stammered, her voice shaking. She tried to pull her arm back, but his grip only tightened. "Answer me," Dae-hyun commanded. He reached out with his other hand and snatched the plastic container from her shaking fingers. He held it up high for everyone to see. "Leftovers? Scraps from my table? Is this what my staff has become? A pack of common thieves?" Era felt the heat of 100 stares burning into her skin. She felt small, dirty, and utterly alone in the middle of all that gold and marble. She looked at the floor, wishing it would open up and swallow her. Tears began to sting her eyes, making the white tablecloth blur into a hazy mess. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was going to be thrown away. I didn't think." "You didn't think?" Dae-hyun interrupted, his voice rising just enough to make the wine glasses on the table vibrate. "You thought you could sneak into my house, take my property, and hide it in your pocket like a rat? In front of my guests." Mrs. Choi appeared in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "I am so sorry, Mr. Kang. I will handle this at once. She will be fired and turned over to the police." Dae-hyun didn't look at the housekeeper. He didn't take his eyes off Era. He saw the way her shoulders were hunched, the way her old uniform was a little too big for her thin frame, and the way she was shaking. He looked at the meat in the plastic container, then back at the girl who looked like she was about to collapse. The room was deathly quiet, waiting for the Iron Boss to deliver his final, brutal judgment. But as he looked at her wide, terrified eyes, something flickered in his own. The silence in the dining room was so heavy it felt like it was crushing the air out of Era's lungs. Every guest at the long table was staring at her, their faces filled with a mix of shock and cold judgment. Dae-hyun did not let go of her wrist. His grip was firm, a constant reminder that he held her entire life in his hand. He looked at the plastic container he had snatched from her, then he looked back at her small, trembling frame. "Empty your pockets," Dae-hyun commanded. His voice was not loud, but it was as sharp as a shard of glass. "I want to see what else you have taken from this house. Silver? Jewelry? How long have you been robbing me under my own roof?" "I haven't stolen anything else, sir. I promise." Era sobbed, her tears finally spilling over and splashing onto her white apron. "Empty them. Now," he repeated. With shaking hands, Era reached into the deep pockets of her maid uniform. The guests leaned forward, their eyes narrowed, expecting to see a gold watch or a diamond ring fall onto the white tablecloth. Mrs. Choi stood by the kitchen door, her face red with anger, ready to call the police the moment a piece of silver appeared. Instead, Era pulled out a small, hard crust of bread wrapped in a thin paper napkin. It was dry and yellowed, the kind of scrap someone would usually throw to a stray dog. Beside it, she pulled out a crumpled piece of lined notebook paper, folded into a tiny square. She held them out in her open palm, her hand shaking so much that the bread crust nearly fell. Dae-hyun frowned, his eyes flickering with confusion. He let go of her wrist and reached for the paper. He unfolded it slowly, the crinkling sound the only noise in the quiet room. He began to read the messy, childish handwriting. "Dear sister," the note began. "Mia's tummy hurt again today because it was so loud and empty. I gave her my half of the rice, but I think she is still sad. Please, can you bring home something tonight? Just a little bit? I promise I will be a good boy and help you clean the floor tomorrow. Love, Leo." Dae-hyun stopped breathing for a second. He looked at the hard piece of bread in her hand, then back at the letter. He realized that the thief in front of him wasn't looking for gold. She was looking for a way to keep 2 children alive. He looked at the expensive, half-eaten steaks on the table and then at the tiny, dry crust in Era's hand. The contrast was like a slap in the face. The guests who had been whispering a moment ago were suddenly very quiet. The woman in the diamond necklace looked away, her face turning a soft shade of pink. The men in tuxedos stared at their wine glasses, unable to look at the girl they had just called a rat. "Is this why you took the meat?" Dae-hyun asked. His voice was different now. The ice was still there, but it was cracking. "They haven't had meat in 3 years, sir," Era whispered, her head bowed so low her chin touched her chest. "I just wanted them to remember what it tasted like. I am so sorry. Please don't hurt them." Dae-hyun didn't answer right away. He crumpled the letter in his fist and looked out at the dark windows of the mansion. He was a man who owned the city, a man who had everything, yet he had never known a hunger that made a child's stomach loud. He looked at the plastic container of leftovers on the table, then he grabbed his heavy wool coat from the back of his chair. "Get your things," he told Era. "We are going to your house. Right now." The night air was freezing as Dae-hyun marched Era out of the grand entrance of the mansion. His long, black wool coat snapped in the wind, making him look even larger and more dangerous than before. Era stumbled behind him, her thin Maid uniform offering no protection against the cold. She felt like a prisoner being led to her doom. A massive black SUV sat idling at the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of a monster. "Get in," Dae-hyun commanded, his voice as flat as a stone. Era sat in the back seat, her hands gripped tightly in her lap. The leather seats were soft and smelled of expensive wood and tobacco, a smell that usually meant power and safety. But to Era, it felt like a trap. Beside her, Dae-hyun sat in total silence. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the plastic container of leftovers he had placed on the middle console. He just stared straight ahead as the driver pulled away from the golden gates of the estate. The car moved smoothly through the luxury district. The streets here were wide and lined with trees wrapped in sparkling fairy lights. The houses were huge and bright, filled with people who never had to worry about a loud stomach. Era looked out the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt ashamed that this powerful man was going to see the truth of her life. She wanted to tell him to turn around, to just fire her and let her walk home, but the words stayed stuck in her throat. Slowly, the view outside the window began to change. The bright lights faded, replaced by flickering street lamps that hummed and buzzed. The wide roads turned into narrow, cracked lanes filled with trash and old, broken cars. The tall glass buildings disappeared, replaced by gray concrete apartments that looked like they were leaning against each other for support. The air here didn't smell like expensive perfume anymore. It smelled of damp earth and smoke. "Is this it?" Dae-hyun asked as the car slowed down in front of a building with shattered windows and a rusted iron door. "Yes, sir," Era whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The 3rd floor. Apartment 3B. Dae-hyun looked out at the dark, crumbling building. He had spent his whole life building an empire of gold, but he had forgotten that the foundation was made of places like this. He saw a group of men huddled around a fire in a trash can, their faces hidden by shadows. He saw a cat dart under a pile of old pallets. He looked at Era, who was trying to hide her face in her hands. The driver stopped the car, and the silence inside the SUV became heavy and suffocating. Dae-hyun reached out and grabbed the plastic container of steak. He didn't say a word as he opened the door and stepped out into the mud of the street. Era followed him, her legs feeling like lead. She knew that once he walked through that rusted door, her secret would be gone forever. The Iron Boss was about to see the ghost in his house, and she was terrified of what he would do when he found her. The stairs creaked under Dae-hyun's heavy boots as he followed Era up to the 3rd floor. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single yellow bulb that flickered like it was about to die. The air smelled of damp concrete and old cooking grease. Era reached the door to apartment 3B and fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking so much that the metal clattered against the lock. She finally pushed the door open, her head hanging low with shame. Dae-hyun stepped inside, and his breath hitched. The apartment was barely larger than the walk-in closet in his bedroom. The walls were peeling, and a small space heater hummed in the corner, trying to fight the cold air coming through a cracked window. In the center of the room, two small children were huddled together on a thin mattress on the floor. Leo and Mia were fast asleep, their small faces pale under the shadows of a worn-out blanket. Dae-hyun moved silently across the room, his expensive shoes feeling too loud on the cracked linoleum. He walked toward the kitchen, which was nothing more than a small sink and a tiny, rusted refrigerator. He reached out and pulled the fridge door open. The light inside was bright and cold, revealing nothing but a half-empty carton of water and a small bowl with a few grains of white rice at the bottom. There was no milk. There were no eggs. There was certainly no meat. "Is this all?" Dae-hyun whispered, his voice sounding strange in the tiny room. Era stood by the door, clutching her apron. "I gave them the last of the bread this morning, sir. I usually eat the scraps from the kitchen before I leave the estate, so I don't need much." Dae-hyun looked around the rest of the room. He saw a small pile of blankets in the corner near the door. There was no second bed. There wasn't even a rug. He realized that Era didn't sleep on a mattress at all. She slept on the hard, cold floor so her siblings could have the only bed they owned. He looked at the high-quality plastic container of steak he was still holding, then at the empty shelves of the kitchen. He felt a sudden, sharp pain in his chest. He had spent his evening arguing about millions of dollars while the girl who polished his floors was wondering if her sister would wake up hungry. He looked at the children again. Leo's hand was resting on a notebook, the same notebook where he had written the letter about a loud tummy. The reality of it hit Dae-hyun harder than any physical blow ever could. "You sleep here?" he asked, pointing to the pile of blankets on the floor. "It's okay, sir," Era said, her voice small and tired. "I'm used to it. As long as they are safe, I don't mind." Dae-hyun closed the fridge door with a quiet thud. He looked at Era, seeing her not as a thief or a maid, but as a girl who was carrying the weight of the whole world on her thin shoulders. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he felt powerless in this tiny, freezing room. He realized that the Iron Boss had been blind to the ghost living in his own house, and for the first time in his life, he felt a deep, burning regret. The silence in the small, cold apartment felt heavier than the millions of dollars Dae-hyun handled every day. He stood in the center of the room, his expensive leather shoes resting on the cracked floor where Era slept every night. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had built a city of glass and steel, and then he looked at the two sleeping children. They were so small, their ribs showing slightly under their thin shirts. He realized that while he was busy being a dragon and fighting for power, he had stepped right over the people who kept his own world running. "How much do I pay you, Era?" he asked. His voice was no longer a growl. It was a low, hollow sound that seemed to come from deep inside his chest. Era looked down at her feet, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron. "Enough for the rent, sir. And a little for the heat. But the prices went up last month. I had to choose between the bus fare to get to the estate and the milk for Mia." Dae-hyun felt a sharp sting of shame. He knew exactly what he paid his staff. He knew he paid them just enough to survive, but he had never cared if they actually lived. He looked at the plastic container of steak on the table, the theft that had started all of this. He had treated her like a criminal for wanting to give her brother a taste of the life he threw in the trash every single night. He was the one who was a monster, not her. "I watched you polish my floors for 2 years, Dae-hyun whispered, more to himself than to her. "I watched you bow your head every time I walked past. I never once asked if you had eaten. I never once looked at your face long enough to see how tired you were." He walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, crumbling street. He saw his massive black SUV idling below, a symbol of a world that didn't care about places like this. He realized that his power meant nothing if he couldn't even protect the girl who lived under his own roof. The Iron Boss felt a crack in his heart that he knew would never close. He turned back to Era, and for the first time, his eyes weren't filled with ice. They were filled with a deep, burning regret. "The head housekeeper, Mrs. Choi," he said, his jaw tightening. "She told me you were lazy. She told me you were always looking for ways to avoid work. Is that why your wages are so low?" Era's eyes filled with tears again. She takes a part of our pay every month, sir. She says it's for training fees. She told us if we complained to you, you would have us thrown out of the city." Dae-hyun felt a roar of fury building in his chest, but it wasn't aimed at Era. It was aimed at the system he had built, a system where the strong ate the weak while he looked the other way. He reached out and gently touched the top of Leo's head, the boy who just wanted his sister to have a full tummy. "Pack your things," Dae-hyun said. This time, it wasn't a cold command. It was a promise. "All of them. You and the children are not staying here another night. The dragon doesn't just take, Era. From now on, the dragon protects." The sun rose over the city, and the golden gates of the Kong estate felt heavier than ever to Era. She walked down the long, paved driveway, holding Leo and Mia's small hands tightly. They were dressed in their best clothes, which were still faded and thin, but she had brushed their hair until it shone. Era's heart was hammering against her ribs. She expected to see her small bag of belongings sitting by the curb. She expected a final, cold paycheck and a command to never show her face again. After all, she had broken the rules of the dragon, and in his world, there were no second chances. When she reached the grand front doors, they swung open before she could even knock. But it wasn't a guard who met her. It was the entire kitchen staff, lined up in 2 perfect rows. They weren't scowling or looking away. They were bowing. Era stopped, her eyes wide with confusion. She looked for Mrs. Choi, the mean head housekeeper, but the woman was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a young man in a crisp white uniform stepped forward and bowed deeply to her and the children. "Welcome home, Miss Lee," he said. "The master is waiting for you in the sunroom." Era led her siblings through the house. The children gasped at the tall ceilings and the sparkling glass, their eyes darting everywhere. When they entered the sunroom, Era nearly tripped over her own feet. The long glass table was completely covered. There were steaming bowls of porridge, plates of fluffy eggs, piles of fresh fruit, and a giant silver platter of sizzling bacon and sausages. There was enough food to feed 10 families, and it was all laid out under the warm morning light. Dae-hyun was standing by the window, his back to the room. He turned around as they entered. He had traded his sharp 3-piece suit for a simple black sweater, making him look less like a boss and more like a man. He didn't look at Era first. He looked at Leo and Mia. He saw the way their eyes were fixed on the food, their small mouths hanging open in shock. "Sit," Dae-hyun said. His voice was quiet and steady. "The food is getting cold." "Sir, I don't understand," Era whispered, her voice shaking. "Am I not being fired?" Dae-hyun walked over to the table and pulled out a heavy velvet chair for her. "I realized that the people in this house were being fed by your hard work, while you were being fed by my scraps. That ends today." He looked at the children and gave a very small, rare nod. "Eat as much as you want. There is more in the kitchen. From now on, no one in this family will ever know what a loud tummy feels like again." Leo looked at Era, and when she nodded, he reached for a piece of fruit like it was made of gold. Mia giggled as she tasted the fresh juice, her pale cheeks finally starting to turn a healthy pink. Era sat down, her legs feeling like jelly. She looked at the feast, then at the man who had caught her stealing just 12 hours ago. The Iron Boss was still there, but the ice in his heart had melted into something protective and strong. She took a bite of the warm bread, and for the first time in her life, it didn't taste like shame. It tasted like hope. The sound of children laughing filled the sunroom for the first time in the history of the Kong estate. Leo and Mia were busy eating their second plates of eggs, their faces bright and happy. Era sat across from them, her heart finally feeling light. But the peace was broken when the heavy wooden doors swung open. Mrs. Choi marched in, her face red and her silver keys jingling at her waist. She didn't look at the children. She only saw Era sitting in a chair that was meant for guests. What is the meaning of this? Mrs. Choi shrieked, her voice like a jagged blade. Era, get away from that table. You are a thief and a disgrace. I have already called the police to come and take you away. Dae-hyun did not move from his spot by the window. He didn't even turn around at first. The room went deathly silent. Mrs. Choi walked closer, her finger pointing at Era's face. And take these little street rats with you. This is a house of high society, not a soup kitchen for the poor. Dae-hyun finally turned. His eyes were not just cold anymore. They were burning with a dark, quiet fury. He walked toward the head housekeeper, his steps slow and heavy on the marble floor. Mrs. Choi stopped talking, her mouth hanging open as she saw the look on his face. She had never seen the boss look at a servant with such pure hatred. You took their wages, Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper. You let this girl starve while she scrubbed my floors. You threatened her, so she would stay silent while you stole from her pocket. Sir, I was only doing what was best for the house. Mrs. Choi stammered, backing away until she hit the wall. You are no longer part of this house, Dae-hyun commanded. He snapped his fingers, and 2 large guards appeared in the doorway. Take her. Ensure she returns every cent she took from the staff. Then, make sure she never finds work in this city again. If I see her face near my gates, there will be no mercy. Mrs. Choi tried to scream, but the guards grabbed her arms and dragged her out of the room. The jingle of her keys faded into the distance until there was only silence. Dae-hyun turned back to Era. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new set of gold keys. He walked over and placed them on the table in front of her. From this moment on, Lee Era, you are the house manager, he announced. The kitchen staff, watching from the hallway, gasped in shock. You will oversee the budget, the staff, and the care of this estate. Your siblings will live here, in the south wing, where the sun hits the windows every morning. They will have teachers, doctors, and the best of everything. Era stared at the gold keys, her eyes filling with tears of joy. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. I am just a maid. Dae-hyun shook his head and rested a large, firm hand on her shoulder. He looked out at the staff in the hallway, his voice rising so everyone could hear him. She is not just a maid. She is the heart of the Kong estate. From this day forward, anyone who speaks a mean word to her, or anyone who tries to hurt her family, is attacking me personally. To touch Era is to touch the dragon. He looked down at Leo and Mia, then back at Era, and gave a very small, honest smile. The Iron Boss had found something more valuable than gold or power. He had found a family to protect. As Era gripped the gold keys, she realized her life as a ghost was over. She was finally seen, finally safe, and finally home.